The candles were already burning when Elena felt the rope of pearls tighten around her throat like a leash disguised as jewelry. Her hands trembled inside long white gloves as the priest lifted his book and began to read words she could not hear over the pounding of her own heart. Marcus stood beside her, smiling at the crowd, but his fingers dug into her wrist hard enough to leave a mark hidden beneath the lace sleeve. Nobody in the hall could see it. Nobody would have stopped it even if they had. Her father sat in the front row with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, watching her the way a man watches a debt finally being paid. He was not looking at his daughter. He was looking at the end of his troubles. The pack elders murmured their approval as the priest spoke of loyalty and duty, words that meant nothing to Elena except the sound of a door closing forever. She had tried everything in the past 3 weeks to stop this moment from arriving. She had begged her father in private, reminding him that Marcus had a temper that turned rooms cold and silent. She had gone to the pack elders and asked if a marriage built on unpaid debts could ever be called sacred. Every door she knocked on had opened just enough to show her a wall behind it. Nobody wanted to challenge Marcus. His family held too much power, too many favors owed, too many secrets buried in old ledgers. Her fate had been decided long before she understood what fate even meant. The priest's voice rose, calling for the exchange of vows, and Elena felt the world narrow into a single point of light directly above the altar. She thought of her mother, gone 3 winters now, and wondered if she would have let this happen. She thought of the woods behind her childhood home, the only place she had ever felt free, and how she might never walk there again once this ring closed around her finger. Then the doors at the back of the hall burst open with a force that shook the candle flames sideways. Shouts rang out from the courtyard, sharp and urgent, cutting through the ceremony like a blade through silk. A guard stumbled through the entrance, blood on his sleeve, calling for the pack leader by name. Chaos rippled through the guests like wind through tall grass. Someone screamed. Chairs scraped backward. The priest froze mid-sentence with his book still open in his hands. Marcus turned toward the noise, his grip on Elena's wrist loosening for the first time since the ceremony began. It was only a heartbeat, barely enough time to notice, but Elena noticed. She had spent her whole life learning to read the smallest openings, the tiny cracks in a locked door, because those cracks were sometimes the only chance a person like her would ever get. She pulled her hand free. Nobody was watching her. Every eye in the hall had turned toward the commotion at the entrance, toward the guard now shouting about riders at the northern gate, about a rival pack testing the borders under cover of the wedding feast. The elders rose from their seats. Marcus stepped forward, his instincts pulling him toward the fight rather than toward his bride, exactly as Elena had hoped without daring to hope it. She did not think, she did not plan. She simply turned and walked, then walked faster, then ran. Her wedding gown gathered in both fists as she pushed through the side door behind the altar, the one meant for the priest's private entrance, the one nobody would think to guard during a ceremony. Cold air hit her face the moment she stepped outside, and it felt like the first real breath she had taken in weeks. Behind her, the sounds of shouting continued, muffled now by stone walls and distance. She did not look back. Looking back had never done her any good. The stables sat at the edge of the pack grounds, past the kitchen gardens and the old well nobody used anymore. Elena knew this path by memory, having walked it 1,000 times as a girl who preferred the company of horses to the company of people who judged her. Tonight the path felt longer, every shadow suddenly sharp enough to be a threat, every sound behind her possibly a guard sent to drag her back to the altar. She reached the stable doors and slipped inside, breathing hard, her wedding dress already torn along one side from catching on a fence post. The stable smelled of hay and leather and animal warmth, familiar and steadying even now. Most of the horses belonged to guests attending the wedding, tied along the outer stalls with fine saddles and polished bridles that marked their owners as important men from important packs. One horse stood apart from the rest, near the far end of the stable, larger than any animal Elena had ever seen up close. Its coat was black as midnight water, its mane thick and untouched by braiding ribbons or decorative beads. No ordinary rider owned a horse like this. Even standing still, it seemed to hold itself with a kind of quiet authority, as though it understood something about its own importance that the other horses did not. Elena did not have time to wonder whose horse it was. She heard voices near the stable entrance now, low and urgent, searching. She recognized one of them as her father's steward, calling her name with the particular sharpness of a man who feared punishment for losing track of her. She moved toward the black horse without letting herself think twice. It turned its head as she approached, dark eyes studying her the way few animals ever studied anything, calm and unreadable. She reached for its bridle with shaking hands, expecting it to shy away or snort in protest at a stranger's touch. It did not move. She led it quietly toward the side entrance of the stable, away from the voices, and swung herself onto its back before her fear could catch up with her courage. The saddle beneath her was finer than anything she had ever sat upon, stitched with symbols she did not recognize, symbols that suggested this horse belonged to someone of considerable rank. She pushed the thought away. There was no time left for careful thinking. The moment she urged the horse forward, it moved like it had been waiting for exactly this command, as though her nervous heels against its sides were a language it already understood. It broke into a run before they even cleared the stable doors, faster than any horse she had ridden before, powerful enough that she had to grip the reins with both hands and lean low over its neck just to stay steady. Behind her, someone shouted. She heard her father's steward call out in alarm, heard other voices join him, heard the distant clang of the wedding bells someone had begun ringing in confusion, unsure whether to celebrate a marriage or announce an emergency. None of it mattered anymore. The horse carried her past the stable yard, past the kitchen gardens, past the old well, and out through the northern gate that the guards had abandoned in their rush to deal with the reported riders. The cold night air stung her face as they raced down the dirt road leading away from everything she had ever known. Her wedding dress streamed behind her like a pale flag of surrender, except she was not surrendering anymore. For the first time in weeks, she felt something other than fear settle into her chest, something sharp and bright that she almost did not recognize as hope. She did not know where the road led. She did not know whose horse now carried her through the darkness at a speed that made the trees blur into shapeless shadows on either side. She only knew that every step took her farther from Marcus, farther from her father's cold calculations, farther from a life that had been chosen for her without ever asking what she wanted. The horse ran on, sure-footed even in the dark, taking turns in the road as though it already knew this path better than Elena ever could. She began to notice, somewhere beneath her fear, that the animal was not running blindly in panic the way a frightened horse might. It moved with purpose, choosing its direction with a confidence that seemed almost deliberate, almost as though it were following a route it had traveled many times before. She pushed the thought aside again. There would be time later to wonder about the horse and its strange, calm intelligence. Right now there was only the need to put distance between herself and the wedding hall, between herself and the life that had nearly swallowed her whole. The moon rose higher as they left the packlands behind, casting pale light over unfamiliar hills. Elena had never traveled this far from home, had never seen this stretch of forest before, and yet she felt no urge to turn back. Whatever waited ahead could not be worse than what she had escaped. She told herself this over and over, whispering it into the horse's mane as the wind tore at her hair and stripped the last decorative pins from her wedding dress, letting them scatter into the darkness behind her like tiny stars falling from the sky. Somewhere far behind, the wedding hall would still be in chaos, guests confused about the interrupted ceremony, guards searching for a runaway bride who had vanished without a trace. Somewhere behind her, Marcus would be discovering that his prize had slipped through his fingers at the exact moment he thought victory was assured. Somewhere behind her, her father would be realizing that his carefully arranged debt payment had ridden off into the night on a stranger's horse. None of that mattered to Elena now. All that mattered was the rhythm of hooves against packed dirt, the cold wind against her face, and the strange, unshakable feeling that this horse, whoever it truly belonged to, was carrying her towards something rather than simply away from something else. She did not yet know how right that feeling would turn out to be, or how far this single desperate choice would carry her into a story far larger than the one she had been trying to escape. The road curved toward a river she could hear before she could see it, water rushing somewhere ahead in the darkness. The horse slowed only slightly as they approached, testing the ground with careful steps before continuing onward without hesitation, choosing a crossing point as though it had used this exact route before. Elena held tight to the reins and let it guide her, trusting an animal more than she had trusted any person in longer than she could remember. Above her, the stars stretched endless and indifferent across the night sky, watching a runaway bride cross into unknown territory on a horse she did not own, running from a wedding that was never truly hers to begin with. She had no plan beyond this moment, no destination beyond distance itself. But for the first time since her mother's death, Elena felt something stir inside her chest that she almost did not recognize. It felt like the beginning of choosing her own life, even if she had no idea yet what that choice would eventually cost her, or who would come looking for the horse she had taken, or how far that search would carry both of their fates before the night was through. The black horse carried her onward into darkness, hooves striking a steady rhythm against the earth, carrying Elena farther from the altar and closer, though she did not yet know it, to a king who would not rest until he found her. Far behind them, in a chamber above the wedding hall where he had been resting before the ceremonies concluded, a man began to stir at the sound of distant shouting. He rose from his bed with the sharp instincts of someone accustomed to danger, moving to the window to look down at the courtyard below, where guards ran in confused circles and someone called out about riders at the gate. He dressed quickly, buckling a sword at his side out of habit rather than necessity, and made his way down toward the commotion, unaware that the true disturbance of the night had nothing to do with rival packs at the border. He had traveled to this wedding as an observer, a guest of honor invited to secure peace between neighboring territories, his presence a formality more than anything else. He had planned to leave at dawn, his business here concluded regardless of how the ceremony ended. He had not expected the night to bring anything more dramatic than polite conversation and forgettable food. He reached the courtyard just as the steward finished explaining the confusion to a group of gathered guests, something about a bride who had vanished during the disturbance, something about a missing horse from the northern stables. The man listened with only mild interest until the steward mentioned the horse's markings, the particular saddle stitched with symbols reserved for only the highest rank. His expression changed the moment he understood. The horse missing from the stables was his own. Elena did not stop riding until the horse itself began to slow beneath her, its breathing heavy, steam rising from its dark coat into the cold night air. She realized only then how far they had traveled, how the forest around her had changed from familiar oak and pine into taller, older trees she did not recognize. The moon had shifted position in the sky, telling her that hours had passed rather than minutes, though it had felt like no time at all, while her heart pounded with fear and something close to exhilaration. She slid down from the saddle on unsteady legs, her wedding dress now stained with dirt and torn along the hem, and led the horse toward a small stream she could hear trickling nearby. It drank deeply while she caught her breath, leaning against a fallen log and finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of what she had just done. She had stolen a horse. She had abandoned her own wedding in front of an entire pack of witnesses. She had humiliated Marcus and defied her father in a single reckless act that could never be undone. There was no going back now, no quiet apology that would smooth this over, no explanation that would make her father forgive what she had done. She had burned every bridge behind her the moment she climbed onto this horse's back. And yet, sitting alone in the dark forest with dirt on her hands and cold air biting at her exposed arms, Elena felt lighter than she had in months. She had made a choice, her first real choice in longer than she could remember, and no matter what came next, that choice belonged entirely to her. The horse lifted its head from the stream and turned to look at her with those same calm, dark eyes it had shown her back in the stable. Elena studied it more carefully now that she had a moment to breathe, noticing details she had missed in her panic. The saddle was made of the finest leather she had ever touched, dyed a deep midnight blue and stitched with silver thread in patterns that looked almost like a crown. The bridle carried the same symbol, small and easy to miss unless someone knew to look for it. She had taken no ordinary horse. Whoever owned this animal held real power, the kind of power that would not simply shrug off the loss of such a valuable creature. A cold unease settled into her stomach alongside her earlier relief. She had escaped one danger only to potentially walk directly into another, one she did not yet understand. She pushed herself to her feet and approached the horse again, running a hand along its neck in a gesture meant to calm herself as much as the animal. "I am sorry," she whispered, though she was not entirely sure whether she was apologizing to the horse or to whoever waited somewhere behind her, growing angrier by the minute at the discovery of their missing property. The horse nudged her shoulder gently, almost as though it understood her worry and wished to reassure her. She allowed herself a small, tired laugh at the absurdity of trusting comfort from an animal she had stolen only hours before. Still, there was something steadying about its presence, something that made the vast, unfamiliar forest feel slightly less frightening. She knew she could not simply sit here until dawn. Whoever searched for this horse would eventually follow the same road she had taken, and staying still only gave them more time to close the distance. She gathered the reins again and considered her options. She had no coin, no supplies, no clear destination. She had only the clothes on her back, a horse that did not belong to her, and a desperate need to put as much distance as possible between herself and everyone who had ever controlled her life. She thought of the border town her mother used to mention sometimes, a place called Ashford Hollow that sat between 3 different pack territories, neutral ground where no single alpha held absolute authority. She had never been there herself, but she remembered her mother speaking of it fondly. describing it as a place where people could disappear into new lives if they were brave enough or desperate enough to try. Elena decided that Ashford Hollow would be her destination, even though she had only a rough idea of its direction and no real certainty that she could find it before her strength or the horse's endurance gave out. It was better than wandering blindly. It gave her something to aim for besides simply running. She climbed back into the saddle and urged the horse forward at a gentler pace this time, no longer racing in blind panic but moving with purpose, conserving what strength remained in both herself and the animal beneath her. The forest thinned gradually as the night wore on, giving way to rolling hills dotted with scattered farmhouses, their windows dark with sleep, unaware of the runaway bride passing quietly along the distant road. As dawn began to color the eastern sky in soft shades of gray and pink, Elena finally allowed herself to consider what she had left behind. Her father would be furious, though she suspected his anger came less from concern for her safety and more from the collapse of whatever arrangement he had made with Marcus's family. The debt that had bound her to this marriage in the first place would still exist, unpaid and unresolved, and she wondered with a heavy heart what consequences her father might face now that his solution had ridden off into the night. She thought of Marcus too, and the particular coldness in his eyes whenever he believed no one else was watching. She had seen that coldness directed at servants who displeased him, at rivals who challenged his authority, and increasingly in recent weeks, at her. She did not regret leaving him standing at the altar. She only regretted that it had taken her so long to find the courage to run. The sound of hoofbeats behind her broke through her thoughts like a sudden crack of thunder. Elena's heart slammed against her ribs as she twisted in the saddle to look back down the road. In the pale gray light of early morning, she could make out at least 3 riders approaching at considerable speed, their dark cloaks marking them as guards rather than casual travelers. She could not tell yet whether they belonged to her father's pack or to some other authority entirely, but their determined pace told her everything she needed to know. They were searching for something, and given the direction they traveled and the speed at which they moved, that something was very likely her. She kicked her heels against the horse's sides, urging it into a gallop despite its evident exhaustion from the night's earlier run. The animal responded immediately, finding reserves of energy Elena had not expected, carrying her forward with renewed speed even as her own arms trembled from hours of gripping the reins. The riders behind her did not fall back. If anything, they seemed to gain ground, their horses fresher and better rested than her own. Elena's mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. If these were her father's men, she would be dragged back to face a marriage ceremony that might now happen without any pretense of choice at all, perhaps even conducted by force given how thoroughly she had humiliated everyone involved. If these were Marcus's men specifically, she did not want to imagine what punishment he might consider appropriate for a bride who had fled at the altar and stolen a valuable horse in the process. She guided her horse off the main road and into a thicker stretch of forest, hoping the uneven terrain might slow her pursuers or force them to lose her trail among the trees. The horse navigated the rough ground with impressive skill, weaving between trunks and leaping small obstacles with a confidence that suggested it had crossed difficult terrain many times before. Elena clung to its back and prayed silently that whoever had trained this magnificent creature had also given it enough intelligence to keep them both from disaster. Behind her, she heard one of the riders shout something to the others, a command she could not quite make out over the pounding of hooves and her own ragged breathing. She risked a glance backward and saw them adjusting their path to follow her into the trees rather than continuing along the road, confirming her fear that this was no coincidental patrol. They were hunting her specifically, and they were not giving up easily. The forest grew denser as she pushed deeper into unfamiliar territory, branches whipping at her face and arms, tearing further holes into what remained of her wedding dress. She had lost any sense of direction beyond simply moving away from her pursuers, trusting the horse to find footing where she herself could see almost nothing in the tangled undergrowth. A steep incline rose suddenly before her, and the horse scrambled up it with powerful strides, sending loose stones tumbling down behind them. Elena leaned forward, gripping the horse's mane, silently begging it to keep climbing, keep running, keep carrying her toward whatever safety might exist beyond this desperate flight. At the top of the incline, she finally dared another glance backward and saw the riders struggling against the same steep terrain, their horses less accustomed to such difficult ground. The gap between them had widened, if only slightly, giving her a small measure of hope that she might yet escape this particular danger. She pushed onward without slowing, following a narrow ridge that overlooked a wide valley below, the rising sun now fully visible and casting long golden light across the landscape. Somewhere in that valley, she hoped, lay safety, or at least distance enough to catch her breath and plan her next move without the immediate threat of capture hanging over her. The horse carried her along the ridge for what felt like an eternity, its powerful legs never faltering despite the exhaustion Elena knew it must be feeling after such a long and desperate night. She wondered, not for the first time, who this remarkable animal truly belonged to, and what kind of person could command such loyalty and endurance from a creature clearly built for far more than simple transportation. Whoever he was, Elena thought grimly, he was probably furious by now, and likely among those searching for his missing horse just as determinedly as her father's men searched for his missing bride. She had no way of knowing that the true owner of the horse beneath her was already awake, already dressed, already gathering his own most trusted guards to begin a search that would take him far beyond the borders of the Packlands, where the wedding had taken place, and far beyond anything Elena could have anticipated when she first climbed onto his horse's back in a moment of pure desperate courage. The sun climbed higher as Elena finally allowed her horse to slow, having put enough distance between herself and her pursuers to catch her breath for the first time in hours. She did not yet know that the man now searching for his stolen horse was not merely some wealthy pack member whose pride had been wounded by the theft. She did not yet know that he was a king, and that kings, once their attention was captured, rarely let go of what they had decided to find. Cale stood in the courtyard of the Blackthorn pack with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable, listening to the frantic explanations of guards who could not agree on a single consistent account of what had happened during the night. One claimed the horse had been startled by the commotion at the northern gate and had bolted on its own. Another insisted a stable hand had been careless with the latch. A third, more observant than the rest, mentioned quietly that a young woman in a torn wedding dress had been seen fleeing in that same direction shortly before the horse went missing. Cale's attention sharpened at that detail immediately. He had come to this wedding as a guest of considerable importance, invited by the Blackthorn pack leader as a gesture of goodwill between territories that had once stood on opposite sides of old conflicts. His presence here had been meant to symbolize peace, nothing more. He had expected an evening of formal ceremony and polite conversation, followed by an uneventful ride home the next morning. He had not expected to wake to chaos, and he certainly had not expected his own horse, a creature bred specifically for his personal use, and trained to respond to no one but him, to vanish into the night carrying an unfamiliar rider. The fact that the horse had allowed itself to be taken at all told Cale something important. His horse did not tolerate strangers easily. It had been trained from birth to recognize threat and hesitation, to resist unfamiliar hands, to remain calm only for those it trusted completely. For a runaway bride in a moment of blind panic to climb onto its back and ride away without the animal throwing her immediately meant one of two things. Either she had approached it with remarkable calm despite her own fear, or the horse itself had made some kind of choice to allow her passage. Cale found himself intrigued by both possibilities. The Blackthorn pack leader approached him with visible discomfort, clearly aware of how badly this reflected on his hospitality. He apologized repeatedly, promising swift punishment for whoever had allowed the theft to occur, offering to send his own men immediately to recover the stolen horse and return it, along with whatever consequences Cale deemed appropriate for the thief responsible. Cale listened politely, though his mind had already moved past the apologies toward more practical concerns. "Who is the woman they mentioned?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying an authority that made the pack leader straighten immediately. The pack leader hesitated before answering, clearly reluctant to admit the full truth. "My steward's daughter," he finally said. "She was to be married this evening to Marcus, of the Eastern Branch family. There was an unfortunate misunderstanding regarding the arrangement, and it seems the young woman took advantage of the commotion at the gate to flee the ceremony." Cale studied the man carefully, noting the careful way he avoided using words like forced or unwilling, choosing instead the softer language of misunderstanding and arrangement. He had attended enough political gatherings in his life to recognize when someone was deliberately smoothing over an uncomfortable truth. He said nothing about his suspicions for the moment, filing the information away for later consideration. "And where is Marcus now?" Cale asked instead. "Furious," the pack leader admitted. "He has already assembled several men to pursue her, though I suspect his intentions have more to do with reclaiming his pride than reclaiming his bride." Something in the man's tone suggested he did not entirely approve of Marcus's methods, though he clearly lacked the authority or courage to intervene directly in matters between two powerful families. Cale filed this observation away as well. His personal guard, a steady and reliable man named Owen who had served alongside Cale since childhood, approached with a grim expression. "The horse's trail leads north, toward the old forest road," Owen reported. "Marcus's men are already following it. along with several from the steward's household. If we intend to recover the horse before they do, we should move quickly. Cale considered his options carefully. He could simply allow Marcus's men to handle the pursuit, wait for his horse to be returned, and continue on with his own business as though nothing significant had occurred. It would have been the simplest path, the one requiring the least personal involvement in matters that were not truly his concern. But something about the situation refused to sit easily with him. He thought of the horse's willingness to carry a stranger, of the careful way the pack leader had avoided admitting the marriage had been unwilling, of the particular coldness he had noticed in Marcus's eyes during the brief moments they had spoken the previous evening. Cale had learned long ago to trust his instincts in matters of character, and his instincts told him that something about this entire situation was far more troubling than a simple case of horse theft. "I will lead the search myself," Cale announced, his tone leaving no room for argument. Owen raised an eyebrow slightly but did not question the decision aloud. He had served Cale long enough to recognize when his king had made up his mind about something, and long enough to trust that Cale's instincts were rarely wrong, even when his reasoning remained unspoken. The Blackthorn pack leader looked visibly uncomfortable at the prospect of a king personally involving himself in what should have been a minor domestic matter, but he offered no objection, merely bowing his head and promising full cooperation from his own household in whatever assistance Cale required. Within the hour, Cale had assembled a small group of his most trusted guards, men who had proven their loyalty and discretion many times over during his years of rule. He gave them clear instructions before they departed. They were to recover the horse, certainly, but they were also to ensure the safety of whoever rode it, regardless of what claims Marcus or the steward might make about her supposed crimes. As they rode out from the Blackthorn packlands, following the trail that led north into unfamiliar forest, Cale found his thoughts returning again and again to the description offered by the observant guard. A young woman in a torn wedding dress, fleeing on her own 2 feet before somehow finding her way onto his horse, and riding off into the night with enough skill to evade capture for hours. He wondered what kind of desperation drove a woman to such extreme measures, to risk everything rather than complete a wedding ceremony that should have been the happiest day of her life. He wondered what Marcus had done, or perhaps what Marcus represented, that made fleeing into unknown darkness on a stolen horse seem like the safer option. He wondered, too, why the thought of finding her before Marcus's men did had settled into his chest with such unexpected urgency. The forest thickened around them as they followed the trail, Owen occasionally dismounting to examine broken branches or disturbed earth that marked the path of a horse moving at considerable speed. The trail led them steadily northward, deeper into territory that belonged to no single pack, land considered neutral ground between several competing territories. "She is moving toward Ashford Hollow," Owen observed after examining the trail more closely. "Or at least, whoever guides that horse knows enough about this region to head in that direction." Cale considered this information carefully. Ashford Hollow had a reputation as a haven for those seeking to escape difficult circumstances, a place where old debts and old marriages sometimes simply ceased to matter under the protection of neutral authority. If the young woman understood this and was deliberately heading there, it suggested a level of planning that contradicted the image of a simple panicked bride running blindly into the night. Perhaps she was more capable than anyone back at the Blackthorn pack had given her credit for. They continued their pursuit through the morning, the trail growing fresher as the hours passed, indicating they were steadily closing the distance despite whatever head start she had gained during the night. Cale pushed his remaining guards to maintain a demanding pace. Driven by an urgency he did not entirely examine or question, focused instead simply on the need to reach her before anyone else did. Around midday, one of his scouts returned from a brief reconnaissance ahead with troubling news. Marcus's men had been spotted along a ridge overlooking a wide valley, clearly closing in on their target from a different angle than Cale's own group. If both parties continued at their current pace, they would likely converge on the same location within hours. Cale's expression hardened at this news. Whatever happened when they finally caught up to the runaway bride, he intended to ensure that Marcus's men were not the first to reach her. He urged his horse forward at a faster pace, his guards matching his renewed sense of urgency without question, all of them sensing that their king's interest in this particular pursuit had shifted into something far more personal than simple recovery of stolen property. Far ahead of them, unaware of exactly how close her pursuers had drawn, Elena continued her desperate flight toward whatever safety she hoped to find, never suspecting that among those now searching for her rode a king determined not merely to recover his horse, but to understand the woman who had dared to ride it into the unknown. Elena's arms ached from hours of gripping the reins, and her legs had gone numb from the constant motion of riding, but she did not dare stop for long. Every time she paused to let the horse rest, She strained her ears for the sound of pursuit, certain that stopping too long would allow the riders behind her to close the gap she had worked so hard to create. The valley she had descended into during the early morning hours gave way to rolling farmland dotted with small streams and clusters of trees. She had left the road entirely now, weaving through open fields whenever possible to avoid being easily spotted, though she knew this also made her progress slower and more exhausting for the horse beneath her. As the sun rose higher, casting harsh light across the landscape, Elena finally allowed herself to consider just how impossible her situation had become. She had no food, having eaten nothing since a light breakfast the previous morning before the wedding preparations consumed her entire day. She had no coin, no supplies, nothing beyond the increasingly ruined wedding dress she still wore, and the stolen horse carrying her farther from everything familiar. Her stomach growled painfully, reminding her of needs she had been too frightened to consider during the desperate hours of nighttime flight. She spotted a small stream ahead, lined with berry bushes that looked promising, and decided the risk of stopping briefly was worth the necessity of finding some kind of sustenance before her strength gave out entirely. She dismounted carefully, her legs nearly buckling beneath her after so many hours in the saddle, and led the horse toward the water. While it drank, she examined the berry bushes nearby, recognizing them from childhood memories of foraging trips with her mother before illness had taken her far too young. These were safe to eat, sweet and slightly tart, and Elena gathered handfuls quickly, eating as she worked rather than wasting precious time sitting still. As she ate, her mind wandered back to the life she had left behind, and for the first time since fleeing the wedding hall, she allowed herself to truly grieve what she had lost. Not Marcus, certainly, and not the marriage that had never been anything but a business transaction dressed up in ceremony and lace. But she grieved the home she had grown up in, the familiar rooms and gardens where she had spent her childhood, the few servants who had shown her genuine kindness over the years despite her father's coldness. She grieved, too, the relationship she had once hoped to have with her father, a relationship that had died slowly over the years since her mother's passing, replaced gradually by calculation and debt and the cold arithmetic of a man who saw his daughter as an asset to be traded, rather than a person to be loved. She had known for a long time that her father viewed her this way, but watching him arrange her marriage to settle his debts had confirmed it beyond any remaining doubt. She thought of her mother often during these quiet moments, wondering what advice she might have offered had she lived long enough to see her daughter facing such an impossible choice. Her mother had been a gentlewoman, kind to everyone she met, but Elena remembered flashes of quiet strength beneath that gentleness, moments when her mother had stood firm against her father's demands despite the risk to herself. Perhaps that same quiet strength lived somewhere inside Elena too, waiting for the right moment to surface. Perhaps fleeing her wedding, however reckless and desperate the choice had seemed in the moment, was simply that strength finally making itself known. She finished eating and allowed herself a few more minutes of rest, sitting beside the stream while the horse continued to drink and graze on the grass nearby. She studied the animal more closely now that she had a moment of calm, noticing again the fine quality of its saddle and bridle, the obvious signs of careful breeding and expensive training. Whoever owned this magnificent creature had invested considerable resources into its care, which meant they would not simply let it disappear without a serious effort to recover it. She wondered, not for the first time, what kind of man commanded such a horse. She imagined someone proud and demanding, accustomed to having his every wish fulfilled without question, the kind of man who would consider the theft of his property a personal insult worthy of severe punishment. The thought sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her chest, and she pushed herself back to her feet, deciding that rest, however necessary, could not continue indefinitely, while unknown dangers potentially closed in from multiple directions. She climbed back into the saddle and continued her journey, the horse seeming refreshed after its brief respite, moving with renewed energy across the remaining farmland toward a distant tree line that Elena hoped might offer better cover from prying eyes. As she rode, her thoughts turned increasingly toward the strange behavior of the horse itself. It had responded to her commands throughout the night with a precision and intelligence that seemed almost unnatural for an ordinary animal. It anticipated obstacles before she could warn it, chose paths through difficult terrain with confident accuracy, and seemed to understand her needs almost before she expressed them through the reins. She began to notice, too, that the horse occasionally resisted her direction in subtle ways, drifting slightly off the course she intended before correcting itself, almost as though some deeper instinct pulled it toward a different destination entirely. She dismissed this observation at first as simple exhaustion affecting her own judgment, but the pattern repeated often enough that she could no longer ignore it. The horse wanted to go somewhere specific, somewhere that was not Ashford Hollow, and Elena found herself wondering with growing unease whether this pull might eventually lead her directly back toward whoever owned it in the first place. She tightened her grip on the reins and redirected the horse firmly toward what she believed was the correct path toward the border town, refusing to let an animal's instincts override her own careful planning. The horse complied for a while, but Elena could not shake the feeling that she was fighting against something larger than simple stubbornness, some deeper training or bond that made the creature naturally inclined to return to its true master regardless of her wishes. The afternoon wore on, the sun climbing high overhead before beginning its slow descent toward evening. Elena's exhaustion grew heavier with each passing hour, her eyes occasionally drooping despite her best efforts to remain alert. She knew she could not continue much longer without proper rest, but the fear of pursuit kept her pushing forward long past the point where her body wanted to stop. As dusk began to settle over the landscape, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple, Elena spotted a narrow river cutting through the terrain ahead, its waters running swift and clear in the fading light. She guided the horse toward it, intending only to allow it a brief drink before continuing onward under cover of approaching darkness. But as they approached the riverbank, the horse suddenly stopped of its own accord, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring as though catching a scent carried on the evening breeze. Elena felt a jolt of alarm at this unexpected behavior and scanned the surrounding terrain for any sign of danger, her heart already racing with the assumption that Marcus's men had somehow found her again. Instead, she saw a lone rider standing beside the water on the opposite bank, his own horse drinking calmly from the river, while he watched her approach with an expression she could not quite read from this distance. Something about his posture, confident and unhurried despite the obvious tension of their sudden encounter, told Elena immediately that this was not one of Marcus's men sent to drag her back to a marriage she had already escaped. She had no way of knowing, in that suspended moment beside the river with darkness falling around them, that she was looking at the very man whose horse she had stolen, the king whose search for his missing property had led him directly to the woman who now rode it, and whose next words would change the entire course of her uncertain future. The horse beneath her, sensing perhaps the presence of its true master across the water, let out a soft sound that seemed almost like recognition, and Elena felt her stomach twist with the sudden certainty that her long night of running had finally reached its end. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Elena sat frozen in the saddle, her mind racing through possibilities while her body remained too exhausted to act on any of them. The stranger across the river studied her with quiet intensity, his own horse standing calmly beside him as though the tension crackling through the evening air meant nothing at all to the animal. Elena finally found her voice, though it came out smaller and more uncertain than she intended. "Who are you?" The man across the water did not answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his eyes moving from her face to the horse beneath her, lingering there with an expression that shifted from surprise into something more complicated, something that looked almost like relief mixed with curiosity. "That is my horse you are riding," he said finally, his voice calm but carrying an authority that made Elena's pulse quicken further. Her hands tightened on the reins instinctively, though she knew fleeing across unfamiliar terrain in her current exhausted state would accomplish nothing, except perhaps injuring both herself and the horse. "I know," she admitted, seeing no point in denying the obvious truth. "I did not mean to take it. I was running, and it was simply there, and I did not think about who it belonged to until it was already too late to turn back." The man's expression softened slightly at her honest admission, though his posture remained alert, careful, the stance of someone accustomed to assessing danger before letting his guard down completely. "You were the bride from the Blackthorn wedding," he said, not quite a question, but not entirely a statement either, as though he was working through the pieces of a puzzle even as he spoke them aloud. Elena felt a fresh wave of shame color her cheeks despite her exhaustion. Whatever this man knew about her situation, whatever version of events had reached him through whispered reports and hurried explanations, she had no way of knowing how much truth remained in that account by the time it found its way to his ears. "I was," she confirmed quietly. "I am not anymore, I suppose. I ran before the ceremony could finish." Something flickered across his face then, an expression she could not fully interpret from across the water, but it did not look like judgment or anger. If anything, it looked like curiosity sharpening into genuine interest. "Why did you run?" The question caught Elena off guard. She had expected accusations about the stolen horse, perhaps demands for its immediate return, perhaps threats about consequences for her theft. She had not expected genuine curiosity about her reasons, and something about the directness of his question, combined with the exhaustion weighing on every part of her body, loosened something in her chest that she had been holding tightly closed for weeks. Because the marriage was never truly mine to agree to, she said, the words coming faster now, tumbling out with an honesty she had not intended to share with a stranger. My father owed a debt to Marcus's family, and I was the payment. Nobody asked whether I wanted this. Nobody cared whether Marcus would treat me with any kindness once the ceremony was finished. I tried every reasonable path to stop it from happening, and none of them worked, so when chaos broke out during the ceremony, I took the only chance I had. She stopped abruptly, suddenly aware of how much she had revealed to a complete stranger standing on the opposite side of a river as darkness settled fully around them. She expected him to look skeptical, perhaps even disbelieving, the way her father's steward had looked whenever she tried to explain her fears about Marcus's temper. Instead, the man's expression had grown serious, thoughtful, his eyes never leaving her face as he processed what she had told him. That does not sound like a marriage, he said quietly. That sounds like a transaction. Something about the way he said it, with such simple clarity, made Elena's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Nobody had ever named her situation so plainly before. Everyone around her had used softer words, arrangement and duty and family obligation, careful language designed to make an unwilling marriage sound acceptable. This stranger, whoever he was, had cut through all of that with a single honest sentence. Yes, she said simply. That is exactly what it was. He was quiet for a moment, considering something, before he spoke again. My name is Cale, he said, and something in the way he offered this information, simple and direct without any of the titles or formal introductions she might have expected from someone of obvious importance, made Elena feel slightly less afraid of him than she had moments before. Elena, she replied, matching his simplicity. He studied her for another long moment before glancing toward the darkening sky, the last traces of orange light fading rapidly into deep blue twilight. It will be fully dark soon, he observed, and you look like you have not slept or eaten properly in far too long. Elena felt a flush of embarrassment at how visible her exhaustion must have been, though she supposed there was little point in trying to hide it after everything she had already admitted to him. I have managed, she said, though even to her own ears the words sounded unconvincing. Cale's expression shifted into something that might have been the beginning of a smile, though it faded quickly into more serious consideration. There are others searching for you, he said. Men from Marcus's household, and from your father's as well. They are not far behind, and I suspect their intentions toward you are considerably less patient than mine. The mention of pursuit sent fresh alarm through Elena's exhausted body, and she glanced instinctively back the way she had come, though the darkness now made it impossible to see anything beyond the immediate riverbank. How close are they? Close enough that continuing to ride blindly through unfamiliar territory in the dark, exhausted as you clearly are, would be far more dangerous than stopping to think carefully about your next move, Cale said. His tone remained calm, but there was an underlying firmness to it, the voice of someone accustomed to being listened to without argument. Elena hesitated, torn between her instinct to keep running and the exhaustion that made every part of her body ache with the need for rest. She studied the man across the river more carefully now, noting the quality of his clothing despite its simplicity, the confident way he carried himself, the fine horse standing beside him that matched the elegance of the one she currently rode. Everything about him suggested someone of considerable importance, and importance, in Elena's limited experience, rarely came without complications. Why would you help me? She asked finally, unable to keep the suspicion from her voice. I stole your horse. You have every right to be furious with me, to drag me back to face whatever consequences you think are appropriate. Cale considered her question seriously before answering. Because something about your situation troubles me more than the loss of a horse ever could, he said. And because I have learned, over many years of dealing with people who claim authority over others, that those who resort to force and debt to control someone rarely deserve the power they hold. His words settled into Elena's chest with unexpected weight. She had spent weeks trying to explain her fears to people who refused to truly listen, who dismissed her concerns as simple nervousness before a wedding, who valued the appearance of duty and tradition over the reality of her well-being. This stranger, met by chance beside a darkening river, had understood in moments what her own father had refused to acknowledge in weeks. I do not know if I can trust you, she admitted honestly, though something in her exhausted, desperate heart wanted very badly to believe that she could. That is fair, Cale said, and something in his easy acceptance of her wariness made her trust him slightly more than his words alone might have earned. You do not have to trust me completely, but I can offer you safety tonight, food, and rest, without demanding anything from you in return, except honesty about what happened. Tomorrow, You can decide for yourself what path you wish to take next." Elena looked at him for a long moment, weighing exhaustion against caution, desperation against the small flicker of hope his words had kindled, despite her better judgment. Behind her, somewhere in the darkness, men who wished her nothing but harm continued their pursuit. Before her stood a stranger offering help, without any clear demand for something in return. She guided her horse carefully across the shallow crossing point in the river, closing the distance between them one careful step at a time, uncertain whether she was making the wisest choice of her desperate flight, or simply trading one set of dangers for another she did not yet fully understand. As she reached the opposite bank, Cale reached out to steady her horse, his hand resting briefly against its neck in a gesture so natural and familiar that Elena understood immediately just how deep the bond between man and animal truly ran. The horse leaned into his touch with obvious contentment, confirming without words everything Elena needed to know about whose horse she had truly been riding all along. "Come," Cale said quietly, turning his own horse toward a narrow path leading away from the river. "There is a small shelter not far from here where we can rest safely until morning." Elena followed him into the deepening darkness, uncertain of what the coming days would hold, but grateful, for the first time since fleeing her wedding, that she was no longer facing the unknown entirely alone. The shelter Cale led her to turned out to be a small stone cabin tucked into a hillside, clearly built long ago as a resting point for travelers moving between territories, maintained just well enough to remain functional despite its obvious age. Inside, a simple hearth waited ready for a fire, along with basic supplies that suggested it was used regularly by people who understood the value of keeping such places stocked for emergencies. Cale built a small fire with practiced efficiency, while Elena sat exhausted near the entrance, watching him work with a wariness she could not quite shake despite everything he had already done to earn a measure of trust. She noticed the careful way he moved, economical and purposeful, nothing wasted, the movements of someone who had spent considerable time surviving in conditions far removed from the comfort of a palace or grand estate. "You seem very comfortable in a place like this," she observed quietly, watching the flames catch and grow. Cale glanced at her, something almost amused flickering across his expression. "I was not born into the life I live now," he said simply. "I spent years traveling through territories much rougher than this one, before circumstances changed my position considerably." Elena wanted to ask more, curious despite her exhaustion about what circumstances could have transformed a traveler into someone commanding such an obviously valuable horse and carrying himself with such natural authority. But something in his tone suggested he was not yet ready to share more than the barest outline of his history, and she respected that reluctance, understanding perhaps better than most the desire to keep certain truths carefully guarded. He produced simple provisions from a pack she had not noticed him carrying, dried meat and hard bread that tasted better to Elena's starved senses than any feast she could remember from her father's grand dining hall. She ate carefully at first, then with increasing eagerness as her body finally registered how desperately it needed nourishment after the long ordeal of the previous night and day. Cale watched her eat without comment, though Elena noticed him studying her occasionally with an expression that seemed to carry more questions than he was willing to voice directly. When she finally finished eating, feeling more human than she had in what seemed like days, she found herself studying him in return. "You still have not told me who you truly are," she said. "Cale is a name, but it tells me nothing about why you have such a fine horse, or why you seem so unafraid of whoever might be searching for it." He considered her observation for a long moment before answering. "I did not tell you immediately because I wanted to understand your situation before mine became a factor in how you responded to me," he said carefully. "People often behave differently once they learn who they are truly speaking with. I have found it more valuable to understand someone's honest character first." Elena felt a flicker of unease at this admission, wondering what exactly he was preparing to reveal that required such careful handling. "Then tell me now," she said. "I think I have earned that much honesty, given everything I have already shared with you." Cale nodded slowly, accepting the fairness of her request. "I am the king of the Northern Territories," he said quietly. "The horse you rode belongs to my personal stables, trained specifically for my use alone." The words settled into the quiet cabin like a stone dropped into still water, and Elena felt her entire body go tense with sudden fresh alarm. She had stolen a king's horse. She had spoken to him with far more bluntness and suspicion than she would have dared had she known his true position from the beginning. Every instinct told her to apologize immediately, to beg forgiveness for her carelessness, to grovel in the manner she suspected most people adopted when addressing someone of such power. Instead, she found herself simply staring at him, processing this revelation alongside everything else she had already learned about him during their brief acquaintance. "You are a king," she repeated slowly, "and you chose to personally chase down a horse thief through unfamiliar forest rather than simply sending guards to handle the matter." "Yes," Cale said, something almost sheepish in his expression now that the truth was fully revealed. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. "Because something about the reports I received troubled me deeply," he finally said. "A forced marriage disguised as an arrangement. A woman desperate enough to flee on a stranger's horse rather than complete a ceremony she clearly did not want. I have seen too much suffering caused by men who believe power gives them the right to control others without consent. I could not simply ignore the possibility that I might be able to help, even in some small way." Elena absorbed his words slowly, feeling the weight of everything he had just told her settle into her exhausted mind. She had assumed, when she first noticed the fine quality of the stolen horse, that its owner would be exactly the kind of man who valued property and pride above all else, someone who would show her little mercy for the inconvenience she had caused him. Instead, she had found someone whose position of considerable power seemed to have made him more thoughtful about the suffering of others, not less. "I do not know how to thank you properly," she said finally, "or how to apologize adequately for taking your horse and causing you such trouble." Cale waved away her concern with a small gesture. "The horse matters far less to me than understanding whether you are truly safe," he said. "Tell me more about Marcus. Tell me exactly what kind of man your father was preparing to bind you to for the rest of your life." Elena hesitated, unused to anyone showing such genuine interest in the details of her circumstances rather than simply the scandal of her flight. But something about Cale's steady attention, combined with the exhaustion loosening her usual careful guardedness, made her want to share the full truth rather than the careful, softened version she had offered everyone else who asked. She told him about Marcus's temper, the way his charm in public settings gave way to coldness and control whenever they were alone together during the brief courtship her father had arranged. She told him about the debts her father owed, debts accumulated through years of poor decisions that had left their family's fortune in serious jeopardy, debts that Marcus's family had offered to forgive entirely in exchange for the marriage. She told him too about her mother, gone now for 3 years, and how much she wished her mother had lived long enough to intervene in this arrangement, certain that her gentle but firm mother would never have allowed such a transaction to proceed regardless of the family's financial troubles. Cale listened to everything without interruption, his expression growing increasingly serious as her story unfolded. When she finally finished speaking, the fire had burned low, and exhaustion had settled so heavily over her that she could barely keep her eyes open. "You did the right thing by running," Cale said quietly, once she had finished. "No debt, however serious, justifies trading a person's freedom and safety as though they were simple currency." Elena felt tears prick unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, exhaustion and relief mixing together in a way that finally broke through the careful control she had maintained throughout her long ordeal. Nobody had told her this so plainly before, with such simple certainty. Everyone in her life had treated the arrangement as though it were unfortunate but necessary, an unpleasant reality that simply had to be endured for the sake of family obligation. "Thank you," she whispered, unable to find better words to express the depth of gratitude she felt toward this unexpected stranger who had shown her more genuine kindness in a single evening than her own father had managed in years. Cale nodded, then gestured toward a small pile of blankets near the far wall of the cabin. "You should rest," he said gently. "Tomorrow we will need to consider carefully how to keep you safe from those still searching for you, and what path forward might offer you the freedom you deserve. But tonight, you have earned the chance to simply sleep without fear." Elena moved toward the blankets gratefully, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion she had been fighting for what felt like an eternity. As she settled into an uneasy but genuine rest, she found herself thinking not of Marcus's coldness or her father's calculations, but of the quiet strength and unexpected kindness of the king who had chased his stolen horse across unfamiliar territory, only to offer its thief shelter, food, and the first honest understanding she had received in longer than she could remember. Outside the cabin, Cale remained awake near the fire for some time, his own thoughts far more complicated than he had let Elena see. He had come searching for a stolen horse and found something he had not expected at all, a woman whose courage in the face of impossible circumstances had struck something deep within him that he did not yet fully understand. He knew, even as exhaustion eventually pulled him toward his own rest, that whatever happened next, he was no longer simply concerned with recovering his property. He found himself, quite unexpectedly, deeply invested in ensuring that Elena found the freedom and safety she so clearly deserved, regardless of what complications that might bring to his own carefully ordered life. Marcus stood in the wreckage of what should have been his wedding celebration, his face pale with fury as servants scrambled around him trying to restore some sense of order to the abandoned hall. The candles had burned down to stubs, the flowers had begun to wilt, and the guests who remained whispered among themselves in hushed tones that Marcus could hear perfectly well despite their attempts at discretion. He had been humiliated in front of every important family from 3 neighboring territories, abandoned at the altar by a woman he had considered nothing more than a convenient solution to his family's need for stronger ties with the Blackthorn steward's household. The insult burned in his chest like a physical wound, made worse by the knowledge that everyone present had witnessed his bride choosing flight over marriage to him. Elena's father approached cautiously, his own expression caught somewhere between fear and desperate calculation. "The debt remains unpaid," Marcus said before the older man could speak, his voice cold and controlled despite the fury simmering beneath the surface. "Your daughter's disappearance changes nothing about what you owe my family." "I understand," Elena's father said quickly, his tone placating in a way that made Marcus's contempt for the man deepen further. "We will find her. She cannot have gone far, and once she is returned, the ceremony can be completed properly this time, with additional precautions to prevent any further disruption." Marcus considered this proposal carefully, weighing his wounded pride against the practical benefits the arrangement still offered his family. The steward's household controlled valuable trading routes that Marcus's family had long wanted access to, routes that would remain available regardless of whether the marriage happened exactly as originally planned, or with some delay to account for Elena's inconvenient rebellion. "Find her," Marcus said finally, "and when you do, understand that I will require assurances that this kind of humiliation never happens again. Whatever methods are necessary to ensure her cooperation this time, I expect you to employ them without hesitation." The steward's expression flickered with something that might have been discomfort, but he nodded regardless, understanding perfectly well the implicit threat behind Marcus's carefully controlled words. Whatever consequences awaited Elena upon her capture, her father was clearly prepared to allow them in service of preserving the arrangement that would save his family from financial ruin. Word of the disrupted wedding spread quickly through the surrounding territories, carried by servants and travelers eager to share such dramatic gossip. By midday, the story had transformed considerably from its original truth, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Some versions claimed Elena had been kidnapped by bandits who took advantage of the wedding chaos. Others suggested she had fled with a secret lover, someone from her past that nobody in the Blackthorn household had ever known about. Still others, closer to the truth but wrapped in additional embellishment, claimed she had stolen a valuable horse belonging to a visiting nobleman and vanished into the northern forests. This particular version of the story reached increasingly wider audiences as the day progressed, eventually catching the attention of travelers who recognized the description of the stolen horse as belonging to someone considerably more important than a simple visiting nobleman. Whispers began to circulate that the missing bride had somehow taken the personal horse of the northern king himself, a detail that transformed the entire scandal into something far more significant than a simple runaway marriage. Marcus heard this particular rumor from one of his own men late in the afternoon, and his expression darkened considerably upon learning the true identity of the horse's owner. If the king himself had become involved in searching for his stolen property, the situation had grown far more complicated than a simple matter of retrieving a disobedient bride. "Are you certain of this information?" Marcus demanded of the man who had brought him the report. "Multiple sources confirm it," the man said. "The king was a guest at the wedding, present as part of diplomatic efforts between territories. His horse went missing during the same commotion that allowed the bride to flee. Travelers along the northern road report seeing him personally leading a search party in that same direction." Marcus considered this new information carefully, his fury tempered now by practical concern for how his family's reputation might suffer if this situation continued to escalate, involving someone of such significant power. If word spread that his bride had fled directly into the path of a king's personal attention, the humiliation of the original abandonment would seem minor compared to whatever complications might follow. He needed to reach Elena before the king's search party did, both to salvage what remained of his family's honor and to ensure that whatever explanation eventually emerged placed the blame squarely on Elena's supposed instability rather than any legitimate grievance against the marriage arrangement itself. "Gather additional men," Marcus ordered. "We ride within the hour, and we find her before anyone else does." Meanwhile, Elena's father received his own troubling news from a separate source, a distant cousin, who worked within the northern king's own territory, and had heard rumors through official channels, rather than simple traveler gossip. According to this more reliable account, The king had not merely sent guards to recover his horse but had personally taken charge of the search, an unusual decision that suggested his interest extended beyond simple property recovery. This revelation troubled Elena's father deeply, though for reasons quite different from Marcus's concerns about family honor. If the king had taken personal interest in Elena's situation, he might learn the full truth about the forced nature of her marriage arrangement, truth that would reflect very poorly on the steward's own reputation, and potentially invite unwanted scrutiny into other questionable arrangements he had made over the years to manage his mounting debts. He found himself now facing an uncomfortable choice. He could continue supporting Marcus's efforts to reclaim Elena and complete the original marriage plan, risking the king's disapproval if the full circumstances came to light. Or he could attempt to distance himself from the situation entirely, perhaps even publicly questioning whether the marriage arrangement had been entirely fair to his daughter, sacrificing the financial benefits Marcus's family offered in exchange for avoiding a potentially dangerous conflict with a powerful king. He chose, in the end, the path that preserved his immediate financial interests, calculating that the king's involvement was likely temporary curiosity rather than sustained commitment to Elena's welfare. Kings, in his experience, rarely maintained interest in such matters once the initial novelty faded, and he suspected that within days, the northern ruler would simply recover his horse and return to more important matters of state, leaving Elena once again vulnerable to whatever consequences her father and Marcus decided were appropriate. He sent his own men out to join the search, instructing them to move quickly and report back immediately if they located Elena before either Marcus's forces or the king's guards did. He wanted his daughter returned to his own custody first, before anyone else could intervene in whatever plans he still hoped to salvage from this disastrous situation. As the sun began its descent toward evening, 3 separate groups moved through the northern forests and rolling farmland, each pursuing Elena for entirely different reasons. Marcus sought to reclaim his wounded pride and ensure the marriage proceeded according to his original demands. Her father sought to protect his own interests and financial security, regardless of the cost to his daughter's well-being. And somewhere among them, though moving with considerably more restraint and genuine concern, Cale's own guards continued their search, following instructions to prioritize Elena's safety above all other considerations. None of them yet knew that Elena herself had already found the king personally, that she now rested safely under his protection in a hidden cabin far from the chaos and calculation still driving her pursuers forward. But as word of the king's personal involvement continued spreading through the surrounding territories, growing more distorted and dramatic with each retelling, it became increasingly clear that whatever happened next in Elena's story would not remain a private family matter for very much longer. The rumors had already transformed a simple runaway bride into something approaching legend, a story of daring escape and royal intervention that would soon reach ears far beyond the immediate territories involved, ears that included influential pack leaders, curious nobles, and eventually, though none yet realized it, individuals with the power to challenge the very foundations of the arrangement that had driven Elena to flee in the first place. Elena woke to the soft gray light of early morning filtering through the small windows of the stone cabin, disoriented for a moment about where she was before the events of the previous day rushed back into her memory. She sat up slowly, her body still aching from hours of riding, and found Cale already awake, sitting near the entrance with a thoughtful expression as he watched the forest beyond the doorway. "You slept well," he observed, noticing her movement. "That is good. You needed the rest more than you likely realized." Elena stretched carefully, testing muscles that protested the previous day's exertion. "I did not expect to sleep at all, given everything happening around us," she admitted, "but exhaustion seems to have overridden my fear, at least for a few hours." Cale offered her more of the simple provisions he had shared the previous night, and they ate together in comfortable quiet for a while, the earlier tension between them having softened considerably after their honest conversation before sleep. Elena found herself studying him more openly now, curious about the details of his life that remained unexplained despite everything he had already revealed. "You mentioned you were not always a king," she said eventually, setting aside her food to look at him directly. "What happened? How does someone go from traveling rough territories to ruling an entire kingdom?" Cale was quiet for a long moment, and Elena wondered if she had overstepped some boundary, pushed too far into territory he preferred to keep private. But eventually he began speaking, his voice carrying a weight that suggested this particular history was not one he shared easily or often. "My father was king before me," he said, "but our relationship was complicated. He believed strength meant ruling through fear, through absolute control, through the same kind of debts and obligations that bound you to Marcus. I disagreed with his methods from a young age, and our disagreements grew serious enough that I eventually left the kingdom entirely, choosing to live among ordinary people rather than remain part of a system I believed was fundamentally unjust. Elena listened with growing fascination, understanding suddenly why this man had shown such immediate sympathy for her situation, why he had reacted with such quiet fury upon learning the details of her forced marriage arrangement. I spent nearly a decade traveling, Cale continued, working among common people, learning what real hardship looked like, understanding firsthand how the decisions made by those in power affected the lives of everyone beneath them. When my father eventually passed, and the responsibility of the throne fell to me, I returned with a very different understanding of what leadership should mean than the one he had tried to teach me. That is why you help people like me, Elena said quietly, understanding blooming within her chest. Partly, Cale admitted, but also because I recognized something in your situation that reminded me too much of the arrangements my own father used to make, treating people as pieces to be moved for political or financial advantage rather than individuals deserving respect and choice. I could not simply ignore that pattern once I recognized it playing out in your life. Elena felt something shift within her as he spoke, a growing respect for this man that went beyond simple gratitude for his help. He had experienced power in its most corrupted form through his father's example, and rather than accepting that corruption as inevitable, he had chosen an entirely different path, one built on genuine understanding rather than inherited cruelty. Thank you for telling me this, she said. I understand now why you did not immediately reveal your position when we first met. You wanted to know if I would trust your character rather than simply your title. Cale nodded, something like relief crossing his features at her understanding. Exactly, he confirmed. Titles mean very little to me personally. I have seen too many people hide behind position and rank to justify behavior that would otherwise be recognized as cruel or unjust. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft sound outside the cabin, hooves approaching carefully through the forest. Elena tensed immediately, fear flooding back into her body, but Cale raised a calming hand, listening carefully before relaxing slightly. That is Owen, he said. One of my own guards. He would not approach so openly if there were immediate danger nearby. Sure enough, moments later, a steady voice called out from beyond the cabin, and Cale rose to greet his guard while Elena remained inside, still cautious despite Cale's reassurance. She heard low voices exchanging information, and when Cale returned, his expression had grown more serious. Marcus and your father have both sent men searching in this direction, he told her. They know now that the horse you rode belongs to me, and that knowledge has apparently made your situation something of a growing scandal across several territories. Elena felt her stomach drop at this news. What does that mean for me? Cale considered his answer carefully. It means the story of your escape has grown beyond a simple family matter, he said. People are talking about it, wondering why a bride would flee so dramatically, wondering what role I might play in whatever happens next. It complicates things, but it may also work in your favor, depending on how we choose to handle what comes next. How so? Because public attention on a situation like this makes it far more difficult for your father or Marcus to simply force you back into an unwilling marriage without consequence, Cale explained. If people are already questioning the circumstances of your engagement, revealing the full truth about the forced nature of the arrangement could turn public sympathy strongly in your favor. Elena considered this, understanding the strategic value of what he was suggesting, even as anxiety twisted through her chest at the thought of her private shame becoming public knowledge across multiple territories. You are suggesting we use this scandal deliberately, she said slowly. I am suggesting we control the narrative rather than allowing Marcus and your father to control it, Cale clarified. If they reach you first and craft their own version of events, they will likely paint you as unstable, ungrateful, perhaps even dangerous, someone who needs to be forcibly returned to proper behavior. If instead the truth becomes known, that this was a forced arrangement built on debt rather than genuine consent, public opinion will shift considerably. Elena absorbed this strategy slowly, recognizing both its wisdom and the vulnerability it required of her. Sharing her full story publicly meant exposing not just Marcus's coldness, but her father's willingness to trade her freedom for financial convenience. Truths she had kept carefully guarded even from herself, for longer than she cared to admit. I am afraid, she admitted honestly. Not just of Marcus or my father finding me, but of what happens if everyone learns the truth about my family, about how little my father actually valued me beyond what I could provide him financially. Cale's expression softened with genuine sympathy. That fear is understandable, he said gently. But hiding that truth only protects the people who hurt you, while leaving you vulnerable to whatever they decide to do next. Sometimes the bravest choice is not simply running from danger, but standing firm enough to expose it fully. Elena thought of her mother then, of the quiet strength she remembered glimpsing beneath her gentle exterior, and felt something settle within her chest, a resolve that had been building slowly since the moment she first climbed onto Cale's horse and rode away from everything familiar. "If we do this," she said slowly, "if we tell the truth publicly, what happens next? Where do I go? What becomes of my life once this scandal settles, one way or another?" Cale was quiet for a moment, something careful and considered in his expression as he formulated his response. "That depends entirely on what you want your life to become," he said finally. "I can offer you protection, certainly, and support in exposing the truth about your circumstances. Beyond that, your future remains entirely your own choice to make, free from anyone else's demands or expectations." Something in his words, in the genuine respect underlying his offer of help without any hidden agenda of control, made Elena feel something she had not experienced in longer than she could remember. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt like someone was offering her a path forward built on her own choices, rather than someone else's calculations. "Then let us tell the truth," she said, her voice steadier now than it had been at any point since fleeing the wedding hall. "Let us stop running, and instead face whatever comes with honesty." Cale nodded, something like pride flickering across his features at her courage. "Then we will need to prepare carefully," he said. "Because once this truth becomes fully known, there will be no path backward, only forward, into whatever consequences and possibilities await us both." Outside the cabin, Owen waited patiently with news that Marcus's search party had drawn considerably closer during the night, close enough that a confrontation now seemed unavoidable within the coming day. Elena felt fear tighten in her chest at this news, but beneath that fear ran something new and unfamiliar, a steady current of determination that told her, regardless of what happened next, she would face it as herself, choosing her own path rather than accepting whatever others tried to force upon her. They left the cabin shortly after sunrise, Cale deciding it would be wiser to meet whoever approached on open ground rather than remain hidden and risk being surrounded without warning. Owen rode ahead as a scout while Cale and Elena followed at a measured pace, both of them silently preparing for whatever confrontation the day might bring. Elena rode her own horse now, a calmer animal that Owen had brought along, allowing Cale to reclaim his own mount while still remaining close enough to offer support should anything go wrong. She found herself grateful for the steady presence of both men beside her, though nothing could fully calm the nervous energy building in her chest as they moved toward whatever confrontation awaited. They had traveled only a few hours when Owen returned from his scouting position with urgent news. "Marcus's men are just ahead, along with several riders from the steward's household," he reported. "They have spotted our approach and are gathering to meet us directly." Cale nodded, unsurprised by this development. "Then let us not keep them waiting any longer," he said, his voice calm despite the tension radiating from everyone around him. They crested a small hill moments later and found Marcus waiting below with nearly a dozen mounted men, along with Elena's father positioned slightly behind him, his expression a careful mixture of relief and calculation as he spotted his daughter riding beside the Northern King. Marcus's eyes narrowed with fury the moment he recognized Elena, though his expression shifted quickly into something more controlled once he registered Cale's presence beside her. He straightened in his saddle, clearly recalibrating his approach now that this had become a matter involving royal authority rather than simply a private family dispute. "Your Majesty," Marcus called out, his voice carrying forced pleasantness that did nothing to mask the anger simmering beneath. "I am relieved to see my bride has been found safely. Thank you for your assistance in locating her." Cale's expression remained neutral, though Elena could sense the careful control he was exercising, holding back whatever genuine reaction he felt toward Marcus's dismissive framing of the situation. "She is not your bride," Cale said simply, his voice carrying enough authority that several of Marcus's men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. "A ceremony left unfinished, with vows never completed, does not create a binding marriage." Marcus's jaw tightened at this direct challenge, though he attempted to maintain his composure. "The arrangement between our families remains valid regardless of the ceremony's interruption," he said. "There are debts owed, obligations that must be honored." "Obligations owed by her father," Cale countered smoothly, "not by Elena herself." "I have learned considerable details about the circumstances of this arrangement, Marcus. Details that suggest this was never a marriage built on consent, but rather a transaction disguised as one." Elena's father shifted nervously at this exchange, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. He urged his horse forward slightly, attempting to insert himself into the discussion. "Your Majesty, Surely family matters such as these are best resolved privately, without the need for royal involvement in what is essentially a domestic arrangement. I disagree, Cale said firmly, turning his attention now toward Elena's father. When a domestic arrangement involves forcing a young woman into marriage to settle her father's debts, without any regard for her own wishes or safety, it becomes considerably more than a private matter. It becomes a question of whether such practices should be tolerated within territories under my influence. The steward's face paled visibly at this direct accusation, understanding immediately the implications of the king's disapproval, extending beyond this single incident into broader scrutiny of his household's practices and decisions. I only wanted what was best for my daughter's future security, he stammered, though the excuse sounded hollow even to Elena's ears. Did you ask her what she wanted? Cale asked directly. Did you consider her feelings at all when arranging this transaction, or only your own financial relief? Elena's father had no answer for this, his silence speaking more truthfully than any explanation he might have attempted to offer. Marcus, sensing the conversation shifting decisively against his interests, attempted a different approach. Regardless of the circumstances surrounding the arrangement, he said, his voice hardening now that pleasant pretense had failed to secure his desired outcome, Elena remains legally bound by the agreement her father made on her behalf. I have every right to insist the marriage proceed as originally planned. Do you? Cale asked, his tone deceptively mild despite the steel underlying his words. I would be curious to hear the full details of exactly what methods you intended to employ to ensure her cooperation this time, given that she has already demonstrated quite clearly her unwillingness to participate in this arrangement voluntarily. Marcus's expression flickered with something dangerously close to panic at this pointed question, understanding that Cale's knowledge extended further than simple sympathy for a runaway bride. Word of his earlier instructions to Elena's father, demanding whatever methods necessary to ensure her cooperation, had apparently reached the king's ears through channels Marcus had not anticipated. Elena watched this exchange with growing courage, feeling the weight of weeks of fear and silence beginning to lift as she witnessed her circumstances finally being named plainly by someone with the authority to challenge them directly. She urged her own horse forward slightly, drawing attention to herself for the first time since the confrontation began. I will not marry you, she said clearly, addressing Marcus directly for the first time since her flight from the wedding hall. Not because I fled once, and circumstances happened to prevent the ceremony's completion, but because I choose, with full clarity and certainty, that I will never willingly bind myself to someone who sees me as nothing more than payment for a debt. Marcus's expression darkened at her direct defiance, but before he could respond, Cale spoke again, his voice carrying clear finality. The matter is settled, he declared. There will be no forced marriage. Any debt owed by Elena's father to your family will need to be resolved through other means that do not involve trading his daughter's freedom as currency. You have no authority to dictate arrangements within another territory, Marcus protested, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. I have every authority to ensure that practices which violate basic principles of consent and dignity are not tolerated within territories that maintain peaceful relations with my kingdom, Cale countered firmly. If your family wishes to continue trading with the Northern Territories, wishes to maintain the diplomatic relationships that benefit your position considerably, I suggest you consider carefully how continuing to pursue this matter might affect those relationships. The implicit threat hung heavy in the morning air, and Elena watched as Marcus's expression shifted through several stages of calculation, before finally settling into grim acceptance of a battle he could not win, without risking far greater losses than a single failed marriage arrangement. Very well, Marcus said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. I withdraw my claim on the arrangement, but do not expect further cooperation from my family regarding the trading routes your steward's household has long depended upon. He turned his horse sharply and rode away without further ceremony, his men following behind him in a retreat that carried far less dignity than his earlier arrival had suggested. Elena's father remained behind, his expression a complicated mixture of relief at avoiding immediate confrontation with the king and dread at the financial consequences he now faced without Marcus's family support. Elena, he said quietly, approaching her with an expression she had rarely seen from him, something that might have been genuine regret mixed with fear of what came next. I know I have failed you as a father. I let my own troubles cloud my judgment about what mattered most. Elena studied him carefully, uncertain whether this apparent remorse was genuine or simply another calculation now that his original plan had collapsed entirely. I do not know if I can forgive what you tried to do, she said honestly. But I am willing to consider a relationship with you built on honesty rather than transaction, if you are willing to offer that in return. Her father nodded slowly, seeming to understand that this was likely the most generous response he could hope for given the circumstances he had created through his own choices. He turned and rode away eventually, leaving Elena alone with Cale and Owen on the quiet hillside. The confrontation finally resolved without the violence or forced compliance that had seemed so likely just moments before. "You did well," Cale said quietly, watching her with an expression of genuine admiration. "Standing firm in your own truth, even when fear would have been the easier path." Elena felt something loosen fully in her chest for the first time since the wedding chaos had begun. A sense of freedom she had almost forgotten was possible. "Thank you," she said, "for giving me the chance to speak my own truth rather than simply hiding from those who wish to control it." Cale smiled then, something warm and genuine that Elena had not seen from him before during their tense journey together. "The truth was always yours," he said. "I simply made certain there was room for it to be heard." The weeks that followed brought changes to Elena's life that she could barely have imagined during her desperate flight through darkened forests on a stolen horse. Word of the confrontation on the hillside spread quickly through the surrounding territories, carrying with it the full truth of her circumstances rather than the distorted rumors that had circulated earlier. Public sympathy shifted decisively in her favor, exactly as Cale had predicted, and Marcus's family found themselves facing considerable social consequences for their role in attempting to force an unwilling marriage. Elena's father, stripped of the financial rescue Marcus's family had once offered, faced his mounting debts with considerably less support than he had hoped for. Yet something in his manner had genuinely shifted since the confrontation, a careful humility replacing his earlier calculation. Elena visited him occasionally in the weeks that followed, their relationship slowly rebuilding on foundations far more honest than anything that had existed between them since her mother's death. She did not know if they would ever be truly close, but she found herself grateful for the small steps toward genuine connection that replaced the transactional coldness of before. Cale offered her shelter within his own territory during this uncertain period, a small home near the northern capital where she could establish her own independent life, free from the pressures and expectations that had defined her existence within the Blackthorn Pack. Elena accepted gratefully, finding in this new environment a freedom she had never known was possible, the ability to make her own choices about how she spent her days, who she spoke with, what path her future might take. She spent considerable time during those early weeks simply learning who she was outside the constraints that had shaped her entire life until now. She discovered a genuine love for working with horses, spending hours in the northern stables learning from the trainers who cared for Cale's remarkable animals, including the very horse whose theft had begun this entire unlikely journey. She and Cale saw each other frequently during this period, though he was careful never to press her toward any particular expectation about what their relationship might become. He seemed to understand instinctively that Elena needed time to fully claim her own freedom before considering any new attachment, however genuine the connection between them had grown during their shared journey. Their conversations deepened gradually over shared meals and quiet evenings, moving beyond the crisis that had first brought them together into genuine friendship, built on mutual respect and growing affection. Elena found herself looking forward to his company more each day, appreciating not just his kindness but his genuine curiosity about her thoughts and opinions, so different from the dismissive treatment she had grown accustomed to within her father's household. One evening, several months after their initial meeting beside the river, Cale invited her to walk with him through the gardens surrounding his palace, the same magnificent black horse that had carried her to freedom, grazing peacefully nearby in a paddock reserved for the animals he valued most highly. "I have watched you build a new life here, with considerable admiration," Cale said, as they walked together beneath a sky just beginning to show the first stars of evening. "You have shown remarkable courage, not just in fleeing an unwanted marriage, but in rebuilding yourself afterward, into someone entirely of your own making." Elena felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, appreciating the genuine respect underlying his observation, rather than simple flattery. "I could not have found this freedom without your help," she said honestly. "You gave me the chance to choose my own path when everyone else in my life only wanted to choose it for me." Cale stopped walking, turning to face her directly, something serious and hopeful mixing in his expression. "I want to ask you something," he said carefully, "and I want you to know that whatever answer you give, our friendship and my support for your independence will remain unchanged." Elena felt her heart quicken, sensing the significance of whatever he was about to say. "What is it?" "These past months, getting to know you properly, watching you build this new life with such determination and grace, I have found myself caring for you in ways that extend well beyond simple friendship, Kale said, his voice steady, despite the evident vulnerability in his admission. I am not asking for any immediate commitment, and I understand deeply why the idea of marriage might carry difficult associations for you after everything you experienced. But I wanted you to know my feelings honestly, and to ask whether you might be open to exploring what could exist between us, at whatever pace feels right to you. Elena studied him for a long moment, considering the weight of his words against the memory of standing at an altar months ago, bound against her will to a man who saw her only as currency. This felt entirely different, an offer built on genuine choice rather than obligation, on mutual respect rather than transaction. I have thought about this too, she admitted softly, about what it might mean to choose someone freely, without any pressure or debt or family expectation forcing the decision. I find that I care for you deeply as well, Kale, more than I expected to when we first met beside that river. Something bright and hopeful lit Kale's expression at her words. Then perhaps, he said carefully, we might consider courtship, in whatever manner feels comfortable to you, without any expectation beyond simply discovering what we might build together. Elena smiled, feeling the genuine happiness of this moment settle into her chest, alongside the hard-won freedom she had claimed for herself over these past months. I would like that very much, she said. They continued their walk through the gardens as darkness fully settled over the palace grounds, their conversation flowing easily into new territory now that both had spoken their honest feelings aloud. Elena found herself thinking, as they walked together beneath the star-filled sky, of how far she had traveled since that desperate night when she climbed onto a stranger's horse and rode away from a life that had never truly been her own. She thought of her mother, wondering if she would recognize the strength her daughter had finally claimed, the courage to run toward freedom rather than accept a fate chosen by others. She thought of the long night of riding through unfamiliar forest, the fear and exhaustion that had driven her forward toward an uncertain destination. She thought of the moment beside the river when she first looked into Kale's eyes and felt, despite every reason for caution, the beginning of trust. Now, months later, that trust had grown into something she had never expected to find, a genuine partnership built on mutual choice rather than obligation, a relationship where her voice mattered as much as his own. She had escaped a forced wedding on a stolen horse, fleeing into darkness with nothing but desperate hope guiding her forward. She had never imagined that same desperate flight would eventually lead her toward a love built entirely on her own free choice, a king who had searched relentlessly not to reclaim stolen property, but to ensure that a stranger's courage found the safety and freedom it deserved. As they reached the edge of the garden where the black horse grazed peacefully in the evening light, Elena reached out to stroke its neck gently, remembering the desperate ride that had first brought her to this unlikely destination. The horse leaned into her touch with familiar contentment, as though it too recognized how completely her circumstances had transformed since that first frantic night. Perhaps, Kale said, watching her with quiet affection, this horse deserves some credit for bringing us together in the first place. Elena laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that carried none of the fear or caution that had marked her earlier life. Perhaps it does, she agreed, though I suspect it simply wanted to come home to its true master, and I happened to be fortunate enough to be carried along with it. Kale took her hand gently as they stood together beneath the darkening sky, both of them understanding that whatever came next in their story would be built on choice rather than chains, on partnership rather than obligation, on the genuine freedom that Elena had claimed for herself the moment she chose to run rather than surrender to a fate she had never wanted. Behind them, the palace lights glowed warm against the evening darkness, marking not an ending but a beginning, the start of a life Elena had chosen entirely for herself, standing finally as the author of her own story rather than a character forced into someone else's design.